What's good? What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report's Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope everybody is well. Thought this was an interesting one. Sad, but nonetheless something we need to keep an awareness of. So, title of this piece you can find on AtlantaBlackStar.com is DNA testing conducted 4 years after Arkansas's black man was executed finds genetic material belonging to someone else. Right? This came out May 6th. It reads, 4 years after the state of Arkansas executed Liddell Lee for the 1993 murder of Deborah Reese, new DNA testing has revealed genetic material at the scene of the crime belongs to someone other than Lee. In January 2020, the Innocence Project and ACLU requested new DNA testing in Lee's case. The city of Jacksonville approved new tests on fingerprints and DNA evidence after the two groups had sued, reported KATV. They recently released summaries of the testing of evidence. After a review of the data, attorneys said that none of the physical evidence linked Lee to the murder, and there were serious flaws in the evidence to convict Lee. Arkansas executed Lee and 4 other inmates in 2017. The Innocence Project and the ACLU reported that the testing uncovered DNA material not from Lee, but from an unidentified male on the wooden club used to murder Reese, as well as a shirt stained with blood that enveloped it. The test determined that Lee's DNA was not present on either piece of evidence. Additionally, let me get this thing off the screen. Additionally, 5 of the 6 hairs tested for mitochondrial DNA excluded Lee as the source. Lee could not be excluded as a potential source in one of the hairs, according to the Innocence Project and ACLU. Mitochondrial DNA testing analyzes DNA shared by all individuals in a common maternal line, including distant relatives. It can be used to exclude known individuals as the source, but cannot be the basis for absolute identification or individualization, said the ACLU and Innocent Project in a press release. There were no possible matches discovered in the National DNA Database. Local attorney Ferronda Brassfield closely observed the case and opposed Lee's execution for an absence of conclusive evidence. I immediately thought this is something we need to determine and establish before we executed him back in 2017. Before you execute someone, make sure you examine all the evidence carefully, especially DNA evidence, because we know now that the DNA evidence can be compelling and definitive to say one way or the other. The Innocence Project and ACLU also said that 5 fingerprints that were found at the crime scene were run in a national database, but the person with those prints is still unknown. Get that a trip. In a statement from Nina Morrison, senior litigation counsel at the Innocence Project, while the results obtained 29 years after the evidence was collected proved to be incomplete and partial, it is notable that there are now new DNA profiles that were not available during the trial or post-conviction proceedings in Mr. Lee's case. Morrison said the groups anticipate that in the future, the databases will provide more valuable information in due course. Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who set the date for Lee's execution, was less than remorseful when reflecting on news about the findings. Whenever you make tough decisions, whenever you carry out the decision of a jury, you realize that it's been reviewed by the Supreme Court at every level, Hutchinson said at a news briefing on Tuesday. They affirmed the convictions, and it's my duty to carry out the law. The evidence, obviously, that's been uncovered is inconclusive, and the fact is that the jury found him guilty based upon the information they had. Now, in this country, we've had a legacy of black men arbitrarily incarcerated and sentenced to death simply because they could. I mean, it's on record. There are police officers that have done this to boost their arrest rates. You had some that did it just because they could, just because they felt a power rush, and many knew that their word could be taken over any given black male. So for a black male to be arbitrarily charged for a murder, even though there's no evidence connecting him to it, there's plenty of precedent over the last century to rule that into question. Plenty of it. There are plenty of anecdotal stories, plenty of events that highlight how problematic this can be. And when you talk about DNA evidence and the degree to which we're finding more and more that black men need to be exonerated because many have been arbitrarily accused with very little backing. And here's the thing. The reason I titled this, what an innocent man looks like, is because that's precisely one of the problems that black men face. Some have framed it as an image problem, but at the end of the day, it even goes deeper than that. The idea of black men being tied to a murderous impulse is so deeply ingrained, you don't often need much more than a black face. Most particularly a black male face, to be clear, right? And that in many people's minds is enough to secure his guilt. This is why it's so interesting to note that, when you have black men that are actually found innocent, especially by a jury, a white jury at that, that's pretty significant. That's pretty significant because most of the time they're walking in with a serious amount of implicit bias. But this case should make us reflect on just how many black men have been incarcerated and killed because they didn't have the means at the time to refute their accusation. I mean, this gentleman here unfortunately died years ago. And it's still by happenstance that they were able to find any kind of DNA evidence to even posthumously suggest he's innocent. How many black men over the generations have experienced this with no rescue? Not even a rescue of their name after the fact, after their I can't really imagine what those numbers must look like. I really can't. I shout out Liddell Lee. I hope there's some peace for his family in some way, at least in that his name was exonerated, reputation rescued to some extent. I feel for the family of Deborah Reese, but at the end of the day, how many black men have died this way? Nobody coming to their rescue. This is sad and yet revealing. And people underestimate the impact of representation, the impact of how we're seen. This is why people fight over movies and television shows and whether or not all the details have been made right. The reason people fight over these things is because they have an impact in the real world. They have an impact on how people see us. As black men, we are guilty on sight. We are guilty at accusation. My mentor, when I was in undergrad, this was even before I had any idea about wanting to be a professor, but he said it to me nonetheless as if he knew. But one day we were sitting in his office and we were talking. This is back in like 95. This had to be like 1995. And he says to me one day, he said, look, I want you to understand something. Your career one day will be in the hands of every 17-year-old girl that walks in your office. I didn't really understand what he was talking about fully at the time. I thought I did. We discussed it a little. I thought I did, but I really didn't. And post Me Too, it makes it that much more apparent, that much more in your face. But, Me Too aside, it's not limited to that by any measure. It's not limited to false accusations of sexual assault or rape. In this context, we're talking about the way black men are seen across the board, the way black men are seen in society, and the extent to which even going to a jury trial can be incredibly dangerous, especially if you're actually not reviewed by a panel of your peers. When you look at that, and black men have been dealing with this since Reconstruction. You can look at a jury, you don't see any peers at all, and you already know your fate in many instances. But just to be clear and to make sure that it isn't overlooked entirely, sometimes I forget to bring up the image. It's the face of an innocent man, in case you didn't know. Does he scare you? Does he look scary, big and bad? If this can be the face of an innocent man, despite how some people may feel about him says a lot about implicit bias. A lot. At the end of the day, there was not enough evidence to justify murdering this brother. And I suspect, I don't even want to postulate how many, but I can't help but pause when I do. I can't keep up with the number of black men that have likely died this way. And that's even if they didn't get an actual trial. Because there was definitely a period of time where you would be lynched without ever being arrested. Sometimes you'd be taken and pulled out of the jail before there was a trial. Sometimes after, it didn't matter. Lynch mob justice. But here's the thing. When lynch mobs did finally give way to some extent to, an actual court, it really didn't change that lynch mob justice exists. It just meant you went through the full rigmarole of the trial and the jury. But if the jury, especially, were all white, for example, especially in the South, and instead of being hung from a tree and burned alive, you were put in an electric chair, what fundamentally is the difference? Especially if in the case in question, there's no evidence that ties you to it. There's been historically far too much leeway, as far as being able to arbitrarily blame and punish black men. And people are comfortable with it. These are the kind of cases that both white society and feminists will throw in the face of black men and say, this is why. And I've seen these tweets. This is why you need to be exterminated. Statements like that. All I can say is that we need to become very critical. And this is why Black Male Studies, as well as the Onyx Report, attempts to use data, attempt to use empirical information. We attempt to use what is verifiable. Because if you go off of just opinion, it justifies this type of treatment. So we have to go off of what's actually measurable. The interesting thing about it is this case produced something that was measurable. How much interest there was at the time is another question. Now, obviously, technology advanced. It opened up a whole new branch of the case that we probably couldn't have found out about as early as 1993, but still, they didn't have enough evidence to do it at the time. Nevertheless, we got to stay vigilant, brothers. We got to stay outspoken. We got to challenge these narratives, and we got to use evidence to do so. So I want you to take this case in every episode of my show, because that's fundamentally what I'm trying to do, is give you arrows to the quiver, give you a sword in the battle, so that you can continue to pull this evidence out and use it to make a case for black men. Nobody else is. So we have to, even amongst ourselves. Because I'm always amazed at how many brothers I'll see that'll look at a guy like this, look at a picture like this, and say things like, well, yeah, he did it. Well, interesting. Anyway, keep the fight up. Keep your head on the swivel, brothers. I wish you well. Peace.